Hello, my name is Trey Marchbanks with Texas A&M University. I'd like to thank you for joining us as we apply the theory of representative bureaucracy to academic performance and school discipline. The research presented here was funded by the Comprehensive School Safety Initiative of the National Institute of Justice. We're very grateful for that funding, but of course, any of the recommendations, conclusions, do not necessarily reflect those of the Department of Justice. Have two great co-authors and co-principal investigators on the project. Dr. Jamelia Blake, also of Texas A&M University, and Dr. Anthony Peguero of Arizona State University. So when we talk about representative bureaucracy, the first thing we have to think about is what we refer to as passive representation. And passive representation is nothing more than how well the workforce of the bureaucratic structure represents or mirrors the population demographics. So if you have a clientele that is 20% African American and 40% Hispanic, you would want the workforce to be 20% African American, 40% Hispanic, for that to be passive representation. Now, active representation is concerned with how that passive representation turns into something that is important. So here, the idea is that individuals who are in the agency advocate for policies that favor their particular group or groups. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're specifically doing it on behalf of their group. It could be the result of having similar life experiences, and so they're interpreting the world through similar experiences. And we've seen lots of studies in the political science literature showing that passive representation leads to active representation. Ken Meyer and his colleagues have done decades of research on this, a lot of it being in the education system. One particular paper shows that the more female math teachers that you have, the better female students perform on math standardized tests. But we want to look at overall representativeness. So how well does a passive representative bureaucracy, how well does that lead to better outcomes for all students, whether or not they're in the majority or the minority at that campus? So we're introducing the idea of purposive passive representation. And this is in recognition that having a passive representation, it can be difficult and likely requires an agency to take steps in order for that to happen. Be proactive in its hiring, recruitment, and those sorts of things. And so the idea with purposive passive representation is that if you do have passive representation, that agency likely values racial and ethnic diversity, and then that diversity should, that value that's being placed upon diversity should play out in the actual outcomes due to the bureaucratic goals and aims. So why do we look at schools when we're talking about bureaucracy? Well, schools are very unique in that the street level bureaucrats have a great deal of autonomy. They're operating, for lack of a better term, behind closed doors with not a lot of day-to-day oversight. Of course, there are evaluations, things along those lines, but day-to-day operations are left to the teachers. It's also one of the largest segments of public services that are out there. Nearly every individual encounters the school system at some point in time, and it also has very important outcomes. How well a student performs in school has been linked to all sorts of other positive outcomes later in life. So for a variety of reasons, schools make a Texas in particular is a very useful environment to test representative bureaucracy. For one, it's a very large school system. There's approximately 4 million students in the Texas school system, which represents roughly 1 in 10 of all public school students in the state of Texas. And Texas also has a great deal of independent school districts, so over 1,000 school districts that represent their own governmental structure in most cases. We also have a very diverse population. 45% of students are Hispanic, 38% white, 14% African American. So we're seeing a great deal of diversity in the Texas school system. So we have data on students beginning from the 2001 and 2002 cohorts, which allows us to follow students on through a great deal of their academic career. Interestingly, the two factors that we're going to analyze were only collected by the Texas Education Agency starting in the 2011-2012 school year. So we're only able to test those years as we look at what's happening. But we are able to control for things that have happened across their academic career because we were following them. And so when we look at how well a school is represented, we needed to come up with a measure of passive representation. So we're looking at congruence. And here we use a modified chi-squared approach of looking at the percent of African American students minus the percent faculty and squaring that, adding them up across, and then taking the square root. So what we end up with is really a measure of congruence, where perfect congruence is 0, perfect incongruence would be 141.4. In our data, we have a mean of 40 and a standard deviation of roughly 23. So this gives us an idea of how well the school is performing as far as passive representation is concerned. The closer to 0, the more congruent they are. Then we also have for one of our analyses, a percent like me. And that is how many of the teachers that a student have the same race ethnicity of that child. And you can see how it'd be easy for a student to have no teachers that looked like them while still having a high level of congruence, because they may be 5% of the school of their race ethnicity, and the school have perfect congruence, and there being very few teachers of that student's race ethnicity. So just because you're in a high congruent school doesn't mean you're going to have a great deal of teachers like you as far as your race ethnicity at that school. So what we're looking at is individual level data, And we have two different analyses. On the first analysis, we are looking at the grade that a student receives in a course. So there, instead of the percent of teachers that look like them, we're looking at that particular teacher and saying, does this teacher have the same race ethnicity as the student? Um, and here it's individual course data that we're looking at. On the second measure, we're looking at the probability of being involved in school discipline. The data from the state of Texas do not record which teacher forwarded the discipline event to administration. So we're looking at the percent of teachers that are of that child's race, and expecting that will serve as a measure of active representation for that student. Now, as we move towards the results, I want to make a point that we're utilizing multivariate analyses. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with multivariate analyses, what that means is we eliminate the effect of a variety of measures. So in this case, what is the child's previous academic performance, as far as standardized test scores, socioeconomic status, things along those lines, so that we can look at the isolated effect of congruence in this particular case, later having a teacher of the same race, while eliminating those other factors that can be related to being in a high congruent or low congruent school. And here we find support for purposive passive representation, where students who attend high congruent schools are performing at roughly half a point better than students that are at low congruent schools. So whenever the school looks like the students as far as race, ethnicity of faculty and students, we're seeing positive outcomes. Now, when we look at it for the same race, we see a similarly high relationship that exists. But it's particularly important for students who are first generation immigrants. The first generation immigrant children, it has almost a point difference. First generation immigrants would be those individuals who are born in another country. Second generation immigrant students see a large benefit as well. And second generation, we're utilizing students who were born in the United States, but whose parents who have limited English proficiency as a proxy for second generation, which has been used in prior research as well. But even for third plus generation students, often referred to as non-immigrants, we're still seeing roughly half a point difference on your course grade, which is substantive. Now, as we move towards probability of discipline, again, now we're talking about looking at the student across the year, because we don't have individual course data for discipline. But we see that if you're in a high congruent school, you have less discipline, which is consistent with a purposive passive representation model. Now, when we look at the probability of discipline, when you have many teachers of the same race ethnicity, it has a counter effect to what we would have expected for active representation. You actually see that discipline is higher for those individuals who have a lot of teachers of the same race ethnicity. Now, we have to be careful because we don't know which teachers referred the individuals for discipline. So it could be that the teachers that are of differing race ethnicities are the ones sending them, and that there's some sort of interactive relationship that exists. But we simply don't have the information to definitively say that. So as we look at conclusions, passive representation does lead to better outcomes, giving support for the idea of purposive passive representation. We also find that active representation finds mixed support. When we're able to definitively link the teacher to the student and the course grade, we see that individuals who are taught by teachers of the same race ethnicity do better, and that those advantages are particularly there for immigrant students. However, we do find less support when we look at school discipline. Again, there are some shortfalls there where we're not sure which teacher is the one sending the student to discipline. But we across measures do find that that passive representation is associated with better outcomes. Thank you very much for your time.